Hello, and welcome to OvaryActive. I'm Dr. Rebecca Dunsmoor-Su.
And I'm Dr. Amy Voedisch, and we are your expert guides on the strange and often uncomfortable journey that is perimenopause. Hi, Rebecca.
Hey, Amy, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm a little red-faced. I was exercising.
Oh, strong work. Strong work. For our listeners out there, Rebecca and I are on the West Coast, and I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, southern part, and Rebecca is visiting my beautiful state today.
Yes, I am. I'm on the Northern California Sonoma coast, and it was such a lovely day, which doesn't always happen here. I decided to go out for a walk, and then I got distracted and came back very red-faced for our recording. But that's okay.
That's okay. We're having a little bit of a heat wave, and so, which is helpful leading into our conversation today on perimenopause and who gets it and how does it differ worldwide and what are the factors that play into the different symptoms that people have.
We in the scientific trade call this the epidemiology of perimenopause, or the who, what, when, where, and why. We've already gone through the why a little bit in our last episode and talked about what's going on hormonally and with the ovaries. But I always like to explain to patients that everybody sort of does the same ovarian pattern for the most part, unless you have surgery or you get chemo and that suddenly sends you into perimenopause or menopause. But everybody experiences it so differently.
Yes, there is no one pattern, which makes it really hard.
It does. It makes it really hard. I think that one of the things we understand is that the pattern can differ based on different factors. So in our last episode, we talked a little bit about it differing because we all have different estrogen and progesterone receptors, right? So they're going to behave differently in different tissues of the body. But I think something we overlook as physicians, because we're just not trained to think about it, is how your social experience, your social environment, your culture impacts your perimenopause and your menopause, right?
Absolutely.
And this is a topic we love. We wrote a whole paper on perimenopause around the world called The Global Menopause Experience. And it was fascinating to talk to physicians all across the world about what they've seen, right?
It is absolutely fascinating. It was so interesting to hear the different stories. You know, you can read studies and they'll say, Swedish women experience this and Australian women experience this, or, hot flashes. The incidence or prevalence of hot flashes changes depending on, Swedish women versus Australian women or whatever, as an example. But I think it's so interesting to actually get down into the sort of culturally, what different cultures think about it on that kind of a level.
And even within the same country, different groups will experience this differently. I think in the United States, we get sort of a microcosm of that, right? Because so much of our country comes from different places, has different culture. They're immigrants. They're people who've been here many generations. So we get to see kind of the whole panoply of perimenopause. How do you like that?
Yes. Ooh, nice word.
And, I think that you can't generalize even for a group of people. So often we'll hear in the United States, African American women have more hot flashes. Asian women don't have hot flashes. I have Asian women in my office all the time having horrendous hot flashes.
Absolutely drenched.
Absolutely drenched. And I have African American women who breeze through menopause and they're like, yeah, never felt hot. It was fine. It's on average is what we're talking about.
They're general patterns, but each individual person is so different.
Right. And I think a lot of those general patterns are driven by what you expect. They're driven by your body habitus, your diet, your social support, right?
Whether you exercise or not.
Right. So many of those things impact your experience of the perimenopause and whether or not you recognize the perimenopause, right? One of the things we'll talk about in another episode is the bleeding signals of perimenopause.
Yes.
So all the really heavy bleeding that can come as the hormones are going up and down really high. But in a lot of African American women who have fibroids at a higher rate than other populations, and we can do a whole episode on fibroids and why that happens, but they may already have been bleeding for 10 years because of those. So how do you interpret that signal?
Well, and I have patients just on that same vein who have, for example, thyroid issues. And so they will already have sort of hot flashes and cold intolerances, and that's been going on their whole life. So then is this a continuation of their known thyroid disease, or are we having, a worsening of what's going on, right? And so that makes it difficult too with that kind of signaling. It really does depend on your medical history, and your genetics play a role. And then there's all of these social constructs that play into it as well.
One of my favorite things is that, can we count how many soy-based menopause supplements exist on the market simply because Asian women have fewer hot flashes in general? Because everyone assumes it's the soy.
If you go to Costco, Whole Foods, any sort of
Oh my
natural
gosh.
supplement, it is just aisles of this stuff. And we're going to have a whole episode on, I call them sort of non-medical treatments or non-FDA approved treatments, but just sort of the over-the-counter stuff, really.
Right.
And what works, what doesn't work. So stay tuned for that. But you could spend your entire paycheck just on supplements.
On soy.
On soy alone. And we're going to talk about soy.
But, the point I'm trying to bring up is that, the whole proliferation of soy-based supplements did not happen because somebody started with soy and said, hey, look, there are phytoestrogens. Let's see if these actually work, and then tested them and then made a supplement. They literally started because somebody said, hey, Asian women don't have hot flashes. It's the soy.
Right.
That's where that comes from. Are there phytoestrogen-like molecules in soy? Yes. They also exist in a lot of other foods that we haven't made a bunch of supplements out of because Asian women don't eat them. But what nobody really thought about is the fact that in soy, those phytoestrogens aren't in an active state. They don't actually bind receptors.
No.
You have to actually turn them into active phytoestrogens, and even then, they're very weak.
And a lot of people don't have the enzyme to be able to do metabolism into the active form. And so you're just having some very expensive soy products that are passing straight through your GI system.
Right. And what I tell my patients is, if you want to take these, eat soybeans. At least you're getting fiber.
You're going to get some kind of a benefit out of this.
Right. When you dry it and grind it up and ultra process it into a capsule, not much left there.
Nope. Not a lot going on.
But I think you and I tend to be on the same side with all of that. We tend to be much more holistic in our approach. If you think there's a nutrient that would be beneficial, the best place to get it is your food.
In its whole form, not in a processed supplement form, but in a whole form. So when we talk about, for example, calcium for bone health, it's so much better to get your calcium from food than it is to get it from calcium supplements. It's just your body processes it so much better.
Right. But we got a little off track there. We're supposed to talk about the epidemiology of perimenopause.
Oh, yes. Let's get back. We have this lovely colleague, Dr. Jennifer Kasursky, who practices in Dubai. So she helped us co-write this paper because we really wanted it to have an international appeal to it. And so Rebecca and I are great at the nuts and bolts of how you handle menopause and perimenopause and the medicine behind it. But our experience is very limited to women in the US and sort of the United States experience. It was wonderful talking to Jennifer, and she did this great job of interviewing, because Dubai is very international. It's very diverse. And so she did this awesome job of interviewing different doctors from different cultures and asking them their experience, either their personal experience as healthcare physicians or what their patients talked about. That was, I thought, absolutely fascinating. So what was one of your favorite stories?
So I thought it was really interesting when she spoke with a physician from South Africa.
Yeah.
Among many cultures in South Africa, there's a fundamental not understanding of reproductive health, that they don't realize that after a certain point you shouldn't bleed.
Right.
So that a lot of women would continue to bleed into menopause, which can be a sign of cancer, and never get it seen to because they just assumed they were still having periods because no one had ever educated them that periods stop. Or, if they were having symptoms, they would more likely go to a natural healer rather than a physician, because women's things just weren't dealt with a physician per se, or they might not go to a physician very often. And, some sort of natural healer who would treat with a combination of herbs and chanting and things like that, because that's where they go for things that are women's business.
the women's side of things.
Right.
Yeah.
How about you? What was one of your favorite stories from that paper?
Looking at how different cultures viewed perimenopause and the menopause transition and what it meant for your role in society. So there were cultures, for example, in Sudan, who once you went through it, it was almost likened to like a death because you were considered, what role did you now have in society because you were no longer of reproductive value because you couldn't reproduce. And one, how sad that is that sort of the only role you have is if you're able to bring children into the world, and sort of leading to, because there was sort of this shame wrapped into it and this sort of sadness and grief and fear around it, it really was considered such a negative thing to have happened. So a lot of times people didn't want to talk about it because it was such, a negative part of their sort of
That does
overall.
make me sad, actually.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is menopause does not happen to most species. It's a uniquely human experience and a couple of other species, but most animals are actually reproductive until they die. And the species that we know experience menopause are human beings, some chimpanzees, beluga whales, orcas, narwhals, and I think some other toothed whales.
I love the narwhal.
The narwhal being the coolest toothed whale.
Oh, of all time.
And, the whole theory behind that is the grandmother theory. And, I think that it's really just interesting to think about the fact that we can consider older women to be too valuable to risk in childbirth, because childbirth is dangerous. And, it's too expensive to risk this font of knowledge in what, at least in the whale communities, are primarily matriarchal societies. These grandmothers know and do all for their family groups. And so risking them in childbirth is not worthwhile.
Well, and Dr. Kosurski, when she did her interview, she did interview one physician who talked about some cultures really embrace this because they are now considered elders.
Right.
And are really respected within their community, which is really cool.
Yeah. I mean, I think it makes perfect sense to me because some of the most interesting women I know are menopausal.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about what does perimenopause look like in the United States? Because I think most of our listeners will be in the United States. We can talk about, other parts of the world as well. But even within the US, we see vastly different experience. And one of the things I always talk to women about is the thing that's been most studied is hot flashes. Here's my personal bias. I think we've studied it because it's easy to count.
It's an objective measure.
Right.
And then you can say, this is happening, and we're going to give you a treatment, and we'll know whether or not it worked because we'll count them. We like objective things.
Yes. So I think most women, when they hear about perimenopause or menopause, they're expecting hot flashes. They're not expecting mood changes, anxiety, sleeplessness, all those things that we actually hear about a lot more.
Brain fog.
Brain fog. Brain fog. We know hot flashes differ between social and ethnic groups in the U.S. We know that African Americans have the highest rate of hot flashes. Caucasians have a middle rate. Asians have the lowest rate. Native Americans tend to be up with Caucasians or in between Caucasians and African Americans, Hispanics as well. People who are ethnically Hispanic tend to be sort of up in the higher range of hot flashes because that's what we studied.
Right.
The question is, do all those other symptoms that we're talking about so often also vary with ethnic groups? And why would these symptoms vary? What's going on in the background? It's not race. And I always like to bring this up. It is not race. Race is not biological. We are all some mixture of races, right? There is no one gene on one arm of one chromosome that makes you black and me white. We've all got a mixture of all of these different genetic lines in us. So it is not race. None of the differences that we see in perimenopause between different ethnic and cultural groups are racially based. Race is a construct. It's a social construct. All of us have different bits of the same genetic lines in us. There is no one gene for black versus white.
Right.
Even, East Asian versus Caucasian, there's some mixing in there. There's no one gene.
Right. Yeah.
So some of it has to do with cultural expectation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If your mother didn't have hot flashes, you don't expect to have hot flashes. You may get warm and you just don't notice it as a hot flash. Some of it has to do with body habitus. So we know that women who tend to be heavier have more hot flashes. And, culturally, ethnically, depending on your diet, you may be on the heavier group. We also know that stress, and what I like to term as toxic stress. So the stress of living in a culture that doesn't value you, the stress of living in poverty, the stress of living on the margins absolutely impacts your hot flashes and all of your symptoms. And especially in the United States, that probably has a lot to do with a lot of the cultural differences we see. It's not to say that there aren't poor, stressed white people. There are. But the proportion of the Caucasian population who are in that group is smaller than the proportion of some of our African American friends and colleagues or the proportion of Hispanic people in this country. And so when you study people as a whole group, you're going to see the impact of those stressors. We see it in all aspects of health, right, Amy?
There isn't a part of health that isn't impacted by this.
No, there's not. And we see it in cancer rates. We see it in susceptibility to infection. Stress is not good for us.
It's not good for us. For you and I mean, we see it in obstetrical outcomes.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
That's huge.
It's one of the major reasons, besides pure racism, and we'll do that separately. It's one of the major contributors to why African American women have higher risk in pregnancy and childbirth in this country, in this supposedly developed country.
Right.
So I think it's important to recognize that populations do experience it differently, but we're not talking about a genetic racial thing. We're talking about the environment and the culture you live in.
Well, and also culturally, it can depend on, is it something that your family talks about and acknowledges is happening versus doesn't? I grew up in the Midwest. You do not talk about things in the Midwest. I mean, I love Minnesota, but we do not have direct conversations about anything. And so you have to have a PhD in nonverbal and obscure verbal communication to really understand what it is that the person you're talking to would like to do. But we don't talk about health things all the time. So just even thinking about my family, we just don't talk about what we're going through, and you kind of just suffer silently. And that was normal. That's considered normal. So then it's really hard to sort of know what to expect for yourself. And then also you're thinking, oh, well, I just need to suffer through this because that's just what we do. And I have so many patients that I'll talk to that say that now they're going through it. They can really understand what their mother was going through. They're like, she would just open up the freezer and just stand there. But I thought she was just insane. Like, I didn't know what, I was like, why is my mom standing in the freezer? Because mom didn't tell you that she was having a hot flash. But she would get red and you're like, oh, mom's really angry at me. It's like, mom's not angry. Mom's just real hot.
I come from I'm a mutt. On my dad's side, it's all British, Scottish, the stoic ones. My mother is Greek and Polish, mostly Greek. We all went through menopause with my mother.
Right. I was going to say.
Every moment of her menopause was shared. But at the same time, it was real.
Right.
I could see she was struggling. She was happy to let us know she was struggling. But, it's just a different approach. And I think for her, it was very cathartic to be able to say those things. But, looking back on it now, having come through it myself, the hot flashes are what we see. And I remember my mother being on hormones, and then the WHI came out. I called her and said, this has come out and this is what it says. And she's like, oh, we got to stop. And so her doctor told her to stop, and she stopped and she suffered. I could see the hot flashes. What I didn't understand was all the emotional stuff going on behind the scenes.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Even in a family where, we live large and loud, no one talked about that part of it.
Well, one, the sleep exhaustion, and then the emotional toll of the anxiety and the depression and the irritability. It's exhausting. So not only are you just, for some people, they're just hot all the time. And sometimes I feel like when the hot flashes are there, it helps a little bit in the sense where you're like, okay, I know what's going on. It's when they aren't there, but everything else is there. You're like, what is going on with me? I just want to kill everybody. I've had it. Like, I'm done. And That I think you're right. And not explaining it so then the family doesn't understand why mom's like totally going off the handle.
I have so many patients who come in who have been diagnosed with premenstrual dysphoric disorder, severe depression, bipolar,
Oh, yeah.
borderline personality disorder. And I just look at them, I'm like, oh, honey, it's just perimenopause.
It's going to get better. I promise.
It's going to get better, but we can make it better now.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and like we've said before, if you have a history of any sort of mental illness, anxiety, depression, irritability, mood instability, this is definitely a time where things relapse and they get worse, right?
I think the other thing we talked about a little bit in our sort of introductory Peri What Now episode is, well, what age? When does this start? And, that's part of the epidemiology. And the answer is, we really don't know. I mean, how do you put how do you solve a problem like Maria? For some reason, the Sound of Music is in my head. It's because it's so subtle. Because it's a spectrum of symptoms that come and go month to month. Because everybody feels it differently. I can't tell you when perimenopause starts. I mean, technically, if we actually follow very closely your hormone patterns and do blood every single month for years, it's probably happening years before you even sense symptoms, right? The subtle changes in hormonal patterns of ovulation. The question of when do the symptoms start and therefore we call it perimenopause is really personal.
Generally speaking, I think about perimenopause being something that's occurring in your 40s, but it certainly can start earlier than that. It can start later than that, but I call that the most sort of typical or general time where you're kind of right in that wheelhouse. We, as a medical community, would often use sort of your periods as a marker. So once your periods start to get wacky, then that's the start of perimenopause. But you and I both know that people can have completely regular menstrual cycles that haven't changed at all, but they're in perimenopause. So
yeah, they're symptomatic from it.
They're symptomatic. So generally speaking, I say anytime in your 40s, but what do you say in your practice? But again, like I said, it could be earlier.
I tell patients that the average age of menopause, so your last period, average age in the US is 51 and a half, right? And if perimenopause can last 2 to 10 years before that, that's your 40.
Yep.
But you can go through menopause at 45 and that's still within the normal range. So we say 45 to 55. So if you're going to go through at 45, you could have perimenopause at 37.
Yep.
Just because you haven't hit your 40s, I'm not going to say you're not perimenopausal.
Agree.
I had this exact conversation with a patient just 2 weeks ago. She'd seen 3 doctors. She's like, I swear I'm perimenopausal, but I'm 38 and everybody says I'm too young. And I'm like, I won't. If you're symptomatic, let me treat your symptoms. I don't care how we want to label it.
Right.
We can call it perimenopause.
Well, it's really interesting because you and I have colleagues and we have, Facebook colleagues on our OBGYN Facebook groups. And often it's very frustrating for physicians because we'll often, it's like, oh, she's in her 30s and she wants me to talk about her hormones or she thinks she's in perimenopause. And they'll just roll their eyes. I'm like, this is just ridiculous. I'm like, well, actually, it might be her hormones. So let's be open to that and hear what she has to say and go from there. And I think in part the frustration comes, if you're listening and you feel like, yes, that was me. I was blown up by 3 different people before somebody would hear me. It's not that I think physicians are trying to be mean. It's that I think they don't know what to do with it. And they're uncomfortable with perimenopause. They're uncomfortable with diagnosing it. They don't really know what to do about it. It doesn't fit in their mind the way that it's supposed to be.
And we don't have a blood test or a survey or anything we can give you that will tell us, yes, this is it. We like certainty in medicine.
And this is one of those times where you're just not going to have it.
No certainty at all. I mean, retrospective certainty. When your period stops, we'll say, oh yeah, that was perimenopause. Not very helpful.
Not helpful looking back.
No. But that's really the only certainty we get in this one. But it is a really tough thing for physicians because we don't like things we can't be certain about. We can't send a test for, which is why a lot of them do send tests. They send hormone tests all the time because they don't understand the fluctuating hormones, but they're just looking for something, a hint of what's going on.
They'll check it and then they'll be like, see, great, it's normal.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they'll check it because they're like, it's going to be normal. And I can tell her it's not her hormones and she can go figure out, what else is going on with a different, physician or whatever. And again, it's not because there's malintent. I mean, no one's trying to not meet you where you're at or treat your symptoms or help you. It's just we don't always know what to do.
I'm going to be a little bit of a pain in the ass. I think sometimes there is not necessarily malintent, but a lack of desire to be curious. I see this sometimes in some physicians who just think all of this is bunk, and that's fine. If this is not their wheelhouse, they should not be treating it. But taking women seriously for the symptoms they are having is always important.
It is always important. And it's not something that has historically been done.
Shocking. We weren't listening to women and what they were going through.
And it's hard because the patriarchy is very real in OBGYN. And it's like the one area of medicine where you're like, oh, we're not going to have the influence of, but it's like, oh no, it is not. We're almost
the worst.
Yeah.
I like to use the example of, when they developed hormone therapy. I was like, oh, they were listening to women. They were having these symptoms. They were developing them a hormone therapy to really help with their symptoms. No. You know what came out that really got hormone therapy going? Feminine Forever.
Oh, yes, that book.
They were just trying to make women young and beautiful forever.
Right.
I didn't give a shit about our hot flashes or our anxiety or our mood changes. They just wanted us skinny and pretty.
Wasn't about how we felt. It's about how we can serve them.
Yes.
How we can make their lives better. That's really our only purpose.
Yeah, well.
That's an episode for another time.
Please don't get us started on that one because it will not stop.
I think the main take-home message is that it's shockingly very diverse. So many different experiences. Really does depend on a lot of different factors. Your genetics, your culture, your family relationships.
Social support,
your social economic status. And just, I think the main message is just to let people know that this can be happening to you even in your late 30s. And if you don't know what it is and you're trying to paste together all these different puzzle pieces, it very well could be perimenopause. It's important to evaluate and make sure we're not missing something else.
Right.
I hate when people blame everything on women's hormones.
That's true.
Right. But it's, if you're like, I'm having this, and this, it's like, it really actually could be perimenopause.
You make a really good point. We get tired as women of being told we're hormonal.
Yes.
It's all hormonal. But you know what? Hormones have a lot of impact on our bodies.
Yes.
They've been driving things for a very long time. And we're going to feel changes in them. That doesn't make us hormonal. That makes us normal and responding to our hormones.
Right.
Men do it too.
I know, but nobody ever talks about that.
Yeah. Men are hormonal just as much as we are. It just looks different because they don't have a menopause. Not even a menopause.
Even though they're trying to get on it.
I know. They want something.
Yep. I saw a headline the other day for andropause, and I was like, please stop.
Please stop.
You don't have to be involved in everything.
No. Let us have this one.
We're taking this one. Sorry, guys. No, we're not playing in the sandbox with this. But it is important, though, because I do tell patients that sometimes I will check other labs and I will check for other things. If they're coming in with fatigue, I will do a workup, a fatigue workup.
If they come in with hair loss, I'm going to check their iron.
Exactly.
They might be anemic.
There could be other things that are going on. And that's the opposite is when people are like, oh, it's your hormones. You're fine. It's not going to kill you. And you're like, oh, well, actually, I have severe underlying anemia leading to hair loss and extreme fatigue.
Right.
Like, okay, we need to treat that. So it is appropriate to do a workup and investigate other causes. I think we just want to make sure that people are getting a full evaluation. And then once we have ruled out other things, then we can address the perimenopause.
Right.
Yeah.
That's perfect. I think that's a great place to end.
I think so too.
And remember, you're not crazy. This is really happening.